So now you're with us. Welcome to Business Edge. And of course, we'll start with Nigeria, which now faces a significant rise in food insecurity, with projections of 26.5 million people affected by August 2024, exacerbated by economic pressures, including inflation, currency devaluation, and removal of fuel subsidies. The Jollof Index, which tracks the cost of preparing jollof rice, a West African staple, reveals the socioeconomic impact of food inflation. The index shows the cost of cooking a pot of jollof rice in Nigeria rose from 20,274 naira in June to 21,300 naira in September. Now, that's a 5.1% increase, illustrating the uphill battle in achieving food security and economic resilience amidst rising prices. Well, Bunmi Bailey, the head of research at SBM Intelligence, joins me for more on this. Thank you, Bunmi, for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Now, look, going through your report, I sort of kept saying, this price has increased and, that other price has increased. But the only things that, that probably recorded a decrease in price are tomatoes and peppers. Yes, yet that has no significance, for the overall plight of the everyday Nigerian. I'd like you to give us an overview of, what this actually means, really looking at what I just talked about.
Okay, so during the course of our research, in the first half of the year, we discovered that a bag of tomato, we discovered that tomato prices, a bag of tomato and pepper was actually spiked to as high as, let's say, within the range of 100,000 to about 110,000. That was because we had tomato Ebola in the first half of the year. So there was a severe infestation of the tomato Ebola, more like like a pest, which actually affected the yield of tomatoes. And when it affected the yields of tomatoes, production was affected. And when production was affected, it led to a scarcity for tomatoes. I remember going to the market and I was, retailers were actually complaining to me that they could not actually get enough tomatoes because of the outbreak of the Ebola that happened earlier in the year. So, but what we now discovered is that in the third quarter of the year, tomato prices now actually trended down. From roughly around 100,000 per bag, we discovered that it went to roughly around 18 to 40,000. So, but another trend that we discovered was a bag of rice that actually spiked. This is actually despite the fact that in September, the government said that they were going to dispose over 600 bags of rice at a subsidized rate. I think it's about 40,000 to consumers. So we're actually wondering why there's a spike in actually a bag of rice. And during the course of the interviews, one of the farmers told us that the flood that happened in July and August, that's the severe floods and the heavy rainfall, it actually destroyed a lot of farmlands, especially around Benue, Niger, Gombe, and one other northern state. So he now actually told me that because the impacts of the flood had actually affected farmers from taking their produce to the market. And when farmers cannot be able to carry their produce to market, you know what that means for food production. So what I foresee for consumers is that right now food prices will continues to spike. If you recall, food inflation rose to about 37.7% in September after dropping for 2 consecutive months.
Now, that's quite interesting, talking about what we're seeing in the markets about prices of goods and services and what have you. But I'm just wondering, we're saying that, some other things have reduced while some things are still increasing. And for me, to my mind, I'm just asking myself, for how much, or how much longer can Nigerians actually continue to go through all of this? This increase in the prices of goods and services, especially food. We're talking about food inflation here, and we know how high it has become, over, of course, we saw some, tapering, but then it's back to going up and all of those things. How much longer can Nigerians actually take this or go through this before we get to a breaking point? Okay,
so I will just refer back to what the World Bank said earlier in the month. In their latest development updates, they said that if we actually be firm, we actually stand the course of the reform, that's why we're firm with the reforms, right, we would see the benefits in at least 10 or 15 years. So what I would say is that, going by what World Bank said, that's what I can actually see. The outlook for the food production is actually very bleak and very gloomy. I talked about the flood. Let me give, for example, before we had the reforms last year, right, we had about 3 major factors that were affecting food production. I mean, we have insecurity, which has persisted for over a decade. I mean, we have climate change, that is unpredictable weather. The early days were not coming enough for planting, right? And then which also delays harvest. And then we also had supply chain disruptions I would normally have. But last year, we had the reforms, which led to high energy costs, and we also depreciated our currency, which actually sparked import costs. And then this year, we have the floods. I mean, like I said earlier, a farmer was telling me that the floods has actually destroyed a lot of farm produce across, let's say, maybe 29 states. And most of these states are major producing states. You can see that the outlook for the sector, right, is actually gloomy. I mean, the agricultural sector has not even grown beyond, let's say, 2%. I mean, for example, last year, right, it's slowed to 1.3% from 1.88%. And then in the first quarter and second quarter of the year, it slowed further to 0.18% before it grew to 1.4%. So you can actually see that trend that we're not even going beyond 2%. And that actually shows that productivity is low. And when productivity is low, you know what that means for food inflation. So like I said, right now, food prices was actually trending now for 2 months, July and August, but it spiked up because you had the aspect of that increase in petrol costs, and now you have the impact of the flood. So, like I said, if measures are not done, or government will not intensify their palliative measures, and we don't have enough measures being taken place to solve these challenges, Nigeria might actually, continue to bear higher prices, and then our poverty numbers will continue to increase. I mean, the World Bank said our poverty numbers rose to about, let's say, 129 million from about 104 million. That means an additional, within a period of 6 months, 25 million people have turned into the poverty net.
Well, that's not a good statistic. So those are not good numbers. They are not encouraging in any way. But talk to me, talking about measures, what measures do you think, beyond what the government is doing? I mean, when we're talking about some of the measures, we're talking about 40,000 naira rice, which you talked about 600,000 bags of rice. We're also hearing things about CNG conversion. We don't know how far they've gone about, with that. We're hearing things about grants and single-digit loans to manufacturers and businesses. All of these are supposed to, in one way or the other, address the high cost of living that Nigerians are going through, and also the high cost of doing business, the high cost of finance, the high cost of everything, actually. I mean, if you ask me. But what do you think the government can do apart from what it is already doing? Or is it the case that what it is doing can actually work, but it has not been done well, efficiently? Is that what the case is?
Okay. Apart from the measures I pointed out earlier about the 40K, the bags of rice are disbursed at a subsidized rate, we also have the 150 import duty waiver on some selected items of food. I heard it was supposed to start in July, but in a recent news, I saw that it had not started yet. So that actually tells me that, okay, how are we effective in actually checking this process? I mean, I would always go back to it. We should not just stop at just disbursing this palliatives or whatever food we want to give to the people, to understand, to give a bit of respite or belief. When we do that, we should also do something I call check, monitor and accountability. I mean, don't just stop at, okay, fine, I've disbursed this bag of rice to one place, right? Let me also check how far, if it actually goes to the right places and also the right people. Apart from that, you can also keep on checking. I mean, I emphasized this when someone asked me a question about the single-digit loans, 50,000 loans that were given to businesses. I said, don't just stop at giving the businesses. Do an impact analysis. Find out, okay, how far has this gone to actually help people? So that's one of the measures we can do. We just need to intensify our approach, not just giving. Let's do monitoring process. Let's check that this actually goes to the right places. And if this is done, then I believe it will be a win-win for the government and for the people.
Well, away from, giving out handouts and all of what structural reforms or, structural I mean, what structural things should the government structural measures actually, should the government be putting in place right now to address some of these issues? I mean, we know the causes. We're talking about flood, we're talking about so many things, climate change, what have you, and of course the high cost of energy. All of this, they have the impact on prices of goods and services. So if we're going to do a structural approach, how do we go about it?
Okay, so one way I can think about, I highlighted the aspect of the floods, which actually occurred in the third quarter of the year. So one of the ways that we can actually tackle the flood, because this flood is something that is not new. I mean, I know it happened in 2022 and it destroyed a lot of rice crops, which actually spiked the bags of rice across different countries. So one aspect I can think of is actually ensure, in a way, build a good drainage system, right? Another aspect I can also think of is building dams. I mean, dams would actually help to prevent the flow of the flood from actually damaging a lot of farmlands. Apart from that, you know, apart from looking at the structural approach, you can also look at the aspect of educating the farmers, right? Tell them, okay, the dangers or the risks of that what can happen to your farmland when flood occurs, and the approach that can help to actually tackle this. Apart from that, we can actually have early warning measures, right? I know that we have an institution called NIMED that actually monitors the weather conditions and all, but we can actually go beyond that, you know, develop and have more early warning measures to be able to prevent and warn people of the flood that would come and affect their farmlands.
Absolutely. Now, taking this away from, you know, what we've been talking about right now, I'd like you to sort of, you know, give us more understanding of the report you did on jollof rice, because I see you went into states and every state had its own and all of that. I mean, let's talk about that now.
Okay, so the index, so let me start about the Jollof Index, right? So it actually looks at how much it would cost a family of 5. Like, for example, an average family of 5 to prepare a pot of jollof. Like you said, I mean, the jollof is a common delicacy, I mean, in Nigeria and also in West Africa. I mean, some of the ingredients we use to measure this index are the major ingredients. I mean, it goes back to rice, tomato, pepper, beef, chicken, turkey, groundnuts, onions, and other seasoning. So since 2016, what the index has done is actually mirrors the current reality of food inflation. Also shows how food prices actually changes over time. I mean, one of our key findings from the report, I mean, across the 13 markets in Nigeria, we discovered the cost of preparing a pot of jollof actually rose by roughly 421%, from about 4,087 naira to about 21,300. So you can actually see how inflation has actually spiked, but incomes are not rising as much as that. That actually shows how this is eating into the pockets of people. And then another key finding that we discovered from the report was that across the 13 markets in Nigeria, we're actually surprised to see that 4 actually recorded a decline. They were majorly in the east, right? And this is different from the trend we saw in the previous report for the second quarter, where all the 13 markets recorded an increase, right? But that's something we're still watching, right? If it's going to happen in our next index, which is going to come out in the first quarter of next year, to be something to be worth to investigate and see what is happening, especially in the southeast.
Okay, so as it is now, you don't have an answer to that.
So what I would say is that during the course of our interview, because it was actually very strange to us, for example, the Onitsha market. I mean, Onitsha is not enough food production happens in that state, and petrol price is actually very expensive around that region. So we're wondering why. So in the course of our interview, I would say a farmer told us something that the only logical explanation you can actually give is that he feels some dealers, right, those retailers were actually, you know, paying people to subsidize their prices. For example, let's say a bag of rice is 80K. They're actually paying them to reduce that price to maybe 50. But like I said, we have something that we're watching for in our next index. If it continues, then it's something to really do a more elaborate investigation on. So back to our other findings. So, and apart from looking at Nigeria, we also looked at Ghana. I mean, we noticed that Jollof Index, right, in dollar terms was actually reducing. But when you look at countries like Ghana, which started in 2023, the country's currency it actually increased. The price of jollof actually increased in both the country's currencies. I mean, normally when a currency appreciates, right, imports become less expensive, and that reduces inflation. But that was the opposite. That's the opposite when there's a depreciation. And I now discovered that when the dollar appreciated, right, the inflation in the US actually fell to about 2.4%. No, sorry, it fell from about 2.5% in September from 2.4% in November, in the previous month. But then when you now look at countries like Ghana and Nigeria, like I said, it's the opposite. I mean, for example, Ghana's currency has actually depreciated to between 18% and 20% this year, For Nigeria, it's around 40%. I mean, that explains why inflation rose. I mean, for example, Ghana inflation rate rose to about 21.5%, and that's the first time in 5 months. I mean, these guys are actually, their inflation rate was actually reducing since last year. So like I said, yes, last month was the first time there was a spike, and it's really driven by importation, right? And then Nigeria, like, well, I would say we've gone back to we're now the fourth largest economy, right? I mean, yes. I mean, inflation also rose, like I said, to about 32.7%, the first time in 2 months. I mean, so you can see both countries were coming from was actually recording a decline in inflation, but all of a sudden there's a spike. And so for Nigeria, I would expect that inflation will continue to rise because of high petrol prices. And like I said, other challenges I've actually highlighted, including the floods.
You know, when you come back to this conversation, I always just want to ask again, what about the people? What can we do for the people? How do we reduce the pressure on the people? Because at the end of the day, the people are the ones who are going to be affected. And people are going to prioritize. Maybe they'll say, you know what, maybe you don't go to school, or you go to a particular type of school. I mean, so many things are going to be sacrificed just to ensure that there is food on the table. And we really need to move fast. I know World Bank talked about 15 years, 10 to 15 years. But while that is happening, I also think that there should be some form of cushioning effects going side by side. But there's not the cushioning effect they're talking about. Some of them have not even taken off. And for the ones that have taken off, nobody's even measuring to say, okay, so this is what we're saying. This is the trend. I mean, things are getting better on this part, but that's not even happening. So where do we go from here? Let me just close with that. Where do we go from here, really? What does the future look like?
You know, I already highlighted the challenges that are in the agri sector. Like I said, we just had about, let's say, 5 factors that affect the sector. I mean, it has increased to about 6. A lot of factors are affecting the agricultural sector, right? I mean, like I said, the future looks very gloomy. I mean, it actually looks very sad, especially when it comes to food. Especially when it looks at food production. That's why I said that we should not just focus on just disbursing. We need to check. We need to monitor how these people are actually getting it. So, and apart from that, we also intensify other measures. You know, I talked about the import duty waiver that was supposed to commence for some food in July, but as at now, nothing has been heard. So, what has actually been done? You know, how do we check if this has actually been implemented? Do
you have other recommendations, really, apart from what the government is currently doing? Maybe we'll close on that.
Okay. Couple of recommendations I can actually highlight. I will still emphasize on it. We need to strengthen our local supply. We need to strengthen our local production. That is what is important. I mean, cost of inputs, right, is very expensive. I mean, farmers were telling me that the cost of a bag of NPK fertilizer has more than doubled to about 50,000 within a year. Right, and that is actually noticeable in around Kano. And you know, you have a lot of rice millers in Kano. It was emphasizing on the cost of inputs, that it needs to actually come down. And apart from that, we also need to encourage mechanized farming, right? In a way, those tractors that are being used for food production, we need to provide them at subsidized rates, right, so that farmers can be able to actually produce in large quantities. Right now, most farmers are just producing, well, before it was small quantities, now they're just producing for their own consumption. Now, you know what that means for food production on a large scale. Another aspect I also talk about is insecurity. Insecurity, it is something that we have been battling with for over a decade.
Absolutely.
Like, it's something I've been over a decade. I mean, we did a research earlier in the year. We discovered, in fact, it's actually funny, we discovered that farmers were actually paying bandits, right, in form of levies, around 140 million from 2020 to 2023 just to access their farmland, right? And you can actually see how this would actually have an impact in food production. Because, for example, if I'm actually paying to actually access my farm land, which is illegal, right? Of course, I have to recoup the money that I've actually paid back. Then, apart from that, you have the tractors, the trucks that are actually carrying this food on the road.
Let's wrap up in about 30 seconds. Yeah, I said that, like 30 seconds.
Okay,
yeah.
So they're already hijacked on the road, right? So that's just something. So you need to increase the security agencies in that channel, not just in the southwest.
All right. Thank you so much, Bunmi Bailey, Head of Research at SBM Intelligence, for your time and your thoughts on the show today.
Thank you.
All right, we'll take a break. When we come back, we have more for you. You're watching Business Edge.